Thank you very much for joining us this morning's webinar on parks and equalities. For those of you who are new to Future of London, we are an independent network supporting those working in planning, housing, regen and infrastructure across London. Where diversity is incredibly important to us. We have a speaker diversity network, which is helping diversify the urban debate and make sure that for those discussions about the future of London, that discussion is representative of Londoners. We also have an emerging talent programme, which is all about trying to get more BAME individuals into the parks and green spaces sector, the housing and regeneration sector. Now, obviously, this webinar came out of the spotlight being put on parks and green spaces during lockdown, and those spaces were real lifelines for people. Particularly if you're living in an area without of your own gardens and private spaces. So it was a really important aspect and really important part of the kind of the debate around lockdown. But obviously, we know that people don't have equal access to parks and green spaces. I work for an organisation called Cave Space, and in 2010, we published some research that found that for those communities with more than 40% BAME people, then there is 11 times less green space, and that green space is of less quality than for areas where it's predominantly white people, and that's just not acceptable. My background is in community engagement. I feel really passionate about making sure underrepresented voices are heard, and was very lucky enough to work in parks. I was a green space judge for many years and joined the Mayor's first London Parks and Green Spaces Commission. We were looking at the way in which parks and green spaces can change the way that there could be different models for delivery given that the budget constraints coming ahead. And one of our recommendations was to set up a centre for excellence. And that's one of the reasons why we've got the GLA sponsoring this event as a way of really starting to have a conversation around what should be included in that centre for excellence in terms of addressing inequalities. And then our other sponsor today is LDA Design. They're an independent consultancy of landscape architects, urban designers and planners, working to connect people and place through landscape. And Andrew is on the panel and joining us today, so very, very warm welcome to Andrew. What I want us to really do today is to, well, first of all, is inviting Dr. Bridget Snaith to talk about her PhD research on the link between parks and ethnicity. I watched her presentation a few weeks ago and I just thought this is just so important for our industry, and I wanted to provide a platform for her to share her findings with our network. And then we're going to broaden the conversation beyond ethnicity, and we've got a fantastic panel today who are bringing in both professional and lived experience of lots of different groups within London. What I want to think about is not just the design of parks and the way we manage them, but also the profession and how representative that is. I really want to come up with ideas and inspiration and practical takeaways for everyone that's joining us today. So talking about the challenges, but also talking about some of the practices that have really worked for parks and how we can make them welcoming to more people. As I said, you've got loads of knowledge as an audience, so please do use the Q&A function to be able to share your thoughts. That's really important for us, and obviously we'll have time for Q&A as well a bit later on. Okay, sorry, just gonna get my next slide. So that's just a very quick introduction to our agenda today. So we've got a 15-minute presentation from Bridget, and then I'm going to invite our panel to give 3-minute responses to Bridget's presentation. We'll have a bit of a discussion and an opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll finish at about 10:55 and 11 o'clock. And then if you want to continue the conversation, you're going to get an email from Sasha as soon as we close this session, where you can jump into another meeting and we'll put in people into small breakout rooms. And we'd really invite you to come and just continue the conversation because it's such a big topic. And we want to try and hear from as many people as possible. And it's just a nice way also of meeting and connecting with other people that are on this call, on this event. Okay, so I'll just run through those. So Bridget Snaith is going to kick us off with her presentation, and then I'll invite responses from our fantastic panel. You can see the names there, but I'll introduce them a bit later on. Okay, so first, a landscape architect, an urban designer, a social researcher. She runs a master's on landscape architecture at the University of East of London, and she advises on inclusive design and equalities. Her PhD back in 2015 was investigating the preferences of majority white clients in designers and the influence that has on underrepresentation for people from Black and Asian minority groups in UK parks. So Bridget, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I've got too many slides to get through, so I'm going to try to move quickly. So the talk today is called Weeds, Wildflowers and White Privilege, and I think we will talk a little bit more about that as I move through the slides. Nicola, could you give me the next slide, please? So the fundamental question that was at the heart of my research, and that I'm still trying to engage placemakers about today, is when almost everybody making park space is white, are park spaces whiter by design? And the phenomenon that prompted that question was something that Nicola has mentioned already, was cave space research in particular, but also my experiences in a community-based landscape practice. I've been working in London with communities of very diverse ethnic backgrounds since 2001. And our practice is very much about working with people to shape space in the way that they would like. In 2012, the plans for the Olympic Park were being discussed. And it occurred to me that the direction of travel was going away from what I had read and understood to be popular with communities from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds in the UK. And I wanted to make a study of how we as landscape architects might be creating spaces for our values and our benefits, and therefore excluding other people. Coming on from that, then I started to be more involved in equalities impact assessment, and some of the work that I'll show today is also from work there in Croydon, where we were working doing equalities impact assessment as part of a parks project run by the local authority. So I think we'll move on to the next slide, but just to say that we found a lot of evidence that placemakers' views do influence underrepresentation of minority groups. And that one of the things that tends to happen is that people are excluded, their views are denigrated, they're trivialized. And this is something that I think we really need to be aware of if we're actually trying to shape space with equity at our hearts. So this is a study by English Nature, the Mean survey, and they've been doing this survey since 2009. And every year they find that there is underrepresentation or a lower frequency of park use for British people who are from Black, Asian or UK minority ethnic backgrounds, when that's compared to people from British white backgrounds, but also that there's underrepresentation of low income groups compared to people with higher incomes. Next slide, please. So the Mean survey has found that there's this issue of less frequent use, but they don't account for that other factor of distribution of green space, which is, as Nicola was saying, unequal and unfair, and that viability, though, being able to find a good park near where you live is not the only issue, because when parks are close by, there's also notable underrepresentation of people of colour that are in the park catchment as users. And it's really different depending on the park. This park illustrated here is Lloyd Park in Croydon, and this is one of the parks we surveyed as part of the work that we were doing for Croydon Council. And it was really noticeable, visibly noticeable, that the park's user group was primarily white, and that even though there's a very diverse ethnic group or ethnic profile in the catchment, and particularly underrepresented were Black users in this particular park. So what we were seeing was different patterns depending on different park structures, and therefore we were asking the question, is the park actually responsible for the users as much as anything else? So next slide, please. What Cape Space found was that there is a stronger relationship between patterns of park use and ethnicity than there is just in terms of income. So there's another factor on top of having the financial resources to be able to make use of leisure time or travel to the green space. And there's also variation between how different ethnic groups who might arguably be equally affected by racism, how they are represented in different parks. And so while racism is absolutely an influence on people's ability to use public space, other factors are at play. Something else that CABE found was that all groups, all people, no matter what demographic factors that were measured or tested for or looked at, valued parks equally as part of making a good neighbourhood. So if the norms of use are varying, then maybe that's because of cultural preference, and we shouldn't assume that white preferences are in fact the correct patterns of use for park space. However, people of colour are reporting regularly and frequently, and even in my research you can see this markedly, that there are significant barriers to use compared to white people's experiences. So the conclusion that I drew from all of this, and which is pretty obvious really, is that park space, like all urban space, is a cultural output. And if everybody who is making park space, or almost everyone who is shaping park space, is white, British white in particular, are parks whiter spaces by design. Next slide, please. So in the PhD, I looked at a sociologist's work called Pierre Bourdieu, and he talks about having legitimate tastes as a means of retaining hierarchies of power. And this process works through reproduction, where institutions and individuals validate, give awards to, give degrees to, give prizes to things that they consider to be legitimate. And at a social level, and even in an institutional level, will undermine other ideas or other values. Legitimate tastes in the UK, looking over a sort of a history of cultural development. From the 18th century, there was a departure from the idea that formal landscapes which showed how people were designing them was a good thing, and those formal landscapes were associated with tyrannical politics. From the 19th century, the city became seen as a corrupter of people, of purity, and that we should seek our liberty in the wilderness, seek escape from the city and the crowd. In the 20th century, there was more development around ideas of the country village, looking back nostalgically to the past before industrialization, and sort of celebrating the cottage garden as being the true England, the country village. And then in the 21st century, we have an ecological aesthetic, which combines science and which is seen as intrinsically true. It combines place value, things coming from the place itself, but only on a physical level, and romanticism. And this is the kind of dominant narrative, the legitimate taste in UK landscape sector today. Next slide, please. So this image isn't only portrayed in professional circles, and here we can see some media representations of what the media consider to be spaces that are good for our health. But the UK norm or legitimate taste is easily contrasted with other views that seem perfectly rational. The city is a progressive place. It can be the centre of culture and aspiration. There is enjoyment to be found in sociability and, the vigor of crowds, the excitement of crowds. Obviously, we're missing that with COVID more and more. For many people, the countryside represents hardship. It's a place that might have backward ideas, and it can be very hostile. And actually, people working with nature can be incredibly positive. So we don't need to dislike spaces that are cultivated. And also for some people, weeds, landscape which appears to have been left untouched, could be seen as being wasted land, an opportunity to be more productive. It could be seen as neglected or dirty, and it certainly could be seen as unsafe. Next slide, please. So with these thoughts in mind, I developed a series of different tests to try to find out what people might value and what kind of landscape choices they might make. And the first one of these is a survey, and I selected a range of images of landscapes of different styles. Next slide, please. And I asked people, if these parks were within 10 minutes of your house, which would you like to visit most? And what I found was that depending on people's self-claimed ethnic identity, that there were very different patterns. And this was mathematically supported with statistical tests. And what we could see is that white respondents, white British respondents, tended to like those landscapes which had more loose plant forms, which conformed more to that legitimate taste ideal that I was talking about, whereas people with other British cultural backgrounds tended to prefer more horticultural spaces, more managed spaces to those more romantic ideals. The most popular space with everyone, though, was the image that represented St. James's Park. And so there's this kind of differentiation between white respondents to this survey and people who had other British cultural backgrounds. Next slide, please. What I also found was that university had a very marked impact on white British respondents and less impact or no impact at all on people from other British ethnic backgrounds. If you'd been to university, you might very well like the meadow and the marsh. And if you hadn't been to university, you were very much less likely to select those spaces as a park that you would prefer to go to if it was close to your house. University graduates tended to be less keen on St. James's Park than people who had not been to university. And Richmond Park, which is the picturesque landscape that was pictured in winter, was very popular in particular with university users. For British Caribbean graduates and British Bangladeshi graduates, in general, the patterns were seen to be very similar, whether you'd been to university or not to university, in terms of the park selections that you made in the survey. Next slide, please. And then looking at the Olympic Park as it was designed, you can see in the North Park how strongly it resembles those images that were preferred by the white participants in the survey. Next slide, please. And especially the university graduates. And hearing then the designers talking about this space, you can hear the sort of the legitimate taste. So John Hopkins talking about how this park was not designed for generalissimos seems to be harking back very much to this idea that if it was a formal landscape, it would somehow be a representation of a tyrannical political regime. And he says that the commitment to non-human issues, the wildlife and the biodiversity, this makes the park more humane. Now, he was quoting a journalist at this point. And listening to the people that I spoke to in the environment around it, they had a very different view of landscapes like this. One felt, this participant in Poplar felt that it was depressing, that it was about a site that was neglected. It was my view, that neglected site, it's just depressing. It's like a waste site. The focus group members in Hackney, similarly, they were looking at these spaces and saying they didn't want to go there. Next slide, please. Looking at the North Park, the legitimate taste was that this was a busy space, unattractive, too cluttered, the visual equivalent of several mobile ringtones going off at once. Whereas for participants, these kinds of spaces seemed exciting. I like to go to the park with a bunch of friends and have a gossip. That we're looking for a range of activities. Next slide, please. So you can see the contrast there between the sort of the legitimate designers, the people with power, and the people in the catchment of the park. And what we found was then, once the park opened, that this was reflected in patterns of use. And so the North Park had overall fewer users than the South Park across the same time frame. And even though there are 60% of people in the catchment from British, Asian, Black, Asian and minority, UK minority ethnic backgrounds, what we saw was that only 23% of users for North Park were from ethnicities that might claim people that I felt might claim that ethnicity. And in the South Park, similarly, I felt that I was able to see more visual indicators of people who might claim Black, Asian and UK minority ethnicity. So it was really based on visual indicators, because I didn't have the resources to ask everyone in this instance for their chosen ethnicity. Next slide, please. Moving on from that, then, it was actually known to the professionals that designed the North Park that it was likely that this space would not appeal to the kind of ethnic and cultural groups that lived around the park. But in their book, The Dynamic Landscape, Hitchmo and Dunnett conclude that people's preferences can be changed, and that because their students' preferences change, then other people can learn to like this landscape, which, as we've seen, is the legitimate taste for designers and UK graduates. Next slide, please. So from our analysis of this survey information, of the focus group information, and also of information that we've gathered from Croydon, what we found is that people's decisions are not based just on aesthetics. They're based on a range of different attributes and characteristics. The space needs to be viable. They need to think that it will be good for them to go there, and it needs to have interest. It needs to hold activities that they will enjoy and be interested in using. Next slide, please. Nicola has talked about the lack of green spaces that are close to where people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups live. And we know that this is to do with structural inequalities in UK society that disadvantages people from these backgrounds. Next slide, please. Another issue of viability is that actually, for some people, even though the green space might be nearby and you might want to use it, it may not be viable. And for British Muslims who cover, dogs off the lead who come up and touch them are a real problem on religious grounds. So this is an equalities issue under the Equalities Act. And if they're touched by their nose and mouth, then they have to wash their clothes 7 times before they can pray. And they pray 5 times a day. So logistically speaking, even if you liked the dogs, going to the park with your children who might also get touched by a dog off the lead can become really problematic. And actually we find that people set dogs on people of colour in UK parks, and British Muslims spoke to me about this happening to them. So a recommendation then, if you're seeking equality, is to consider how much dog-free space there is and whether that provision is as good as the space for people who enjoy walking dogs. Next slide, please. Thinking about what's healthful for people, certainly being worried about your children, feeling that you will be made unwelcome, that can lead to stress. But most of all, one of the very key things is to feel that you're going to be safe there. We also found that people were looking for spaces that felt fresh and were green. So considering how things are framed. It's not just about the aesthetic, but whether or not you can feel safe in that space, whether or not you can be seen, whether you can see your children. These are all things that people will find influences their feelings of safety. And again, dogs off leads and dog mess is a really significant issue for a lot of people. Next slide, please. Very quickly then, just looking at Ashburton Park, this was statistical information based on racial characteristics because it was part of the Equalities Impact Assessment there. And that is based on race in terms of the Equalities Act protection. So next slide, please. We asked people what made them go to the park, what were their interests, and they had freedom to answer how they liked. These are the preferences for people who claimed a white ethnic background. Next slide, please. These are the preferences for people who claimed any Black ethnic background. Next slide, please. And we've missed the Asian background slide. Oh, well, we can see, there we are. There's the slide for people who claimed an ethnic background that would be categorized under the census as Asian. Next slide, please. Looking at all of those slides together, you can see significant variation. For example, the popularity of going for a walk or walking the dog is hugely different between these different groups. But one thing that's consistent is the interest in wildlife. So if you're thinking that people aren't interested in wildlife or they're disconnected from nature, that really doesn't seem to be the case. There are very much things that structure people's interest in park space, and they'll vary. So it's something to really think about. What's possible will influence your audience. And also something to bear in mind is that for audiences who are having to pay to use any facilities, this could be an equalities issue because a lot of activities that are paid for are ones that require infrastructure, and the white preferences that we've found are ones that require less infrastructure, like walking or walking the dog. Next slide, please. So overall, we find that attractive, healthy nature is not one thing, and people perceive, interact with, and value nature differently. And equality is not about treating everyone the same way. It's about recognizing and respecting diversity enough to adapt practice. Next slide, please. We have recommendations. Most importantly, think about the diversity of viability, interest, and healthfulness, and try to consider this for the different audiences. Try to hear what they're saying, and don't try to think that your view is better if you're trying to include them in the space. If it's for them, then listen to them. I think we'll leave it there and go to questions. Sorry, I've overrun.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I think there's just so much in that presentation that we could spend the next hour just debating all the issues that you brought up. I see we've got some questions coming up already, which is great. I'm now going to invite our panel. Oh, sorry. I'm now going to invite our panel to give their 3-minute responses to Bridget's presentation from their own point of view. I'll start with Andrew first. Now, Andrew Harland is a director at LDA Design. He's designed many parks in London, including the Olympic Park and Burgess Park in South London. So, Andrew, your kind of responses and reflections from the point of view of a designer. Andrew, can you hear us? Sorry. Have we got Andrew? No? Don't think we've got Andrew. Okay, well, let's move on. So I was next going to come to Mary Karima Brooker, who is an Assistant Park Strategy and Development Officer in Greenwich, with experience of both parks in the UK and in Uganda. So, Mary, from what you've heard from Bridget's presentation, how does that align with your own experience?
Thank you, Bridget. Amazing piece of work. So I would like to share a little bit of lived experience based on Bridget's presentation. And the reality, especially during COVID-19, has been that people of Black, Asian, and ethnic minority groups mainly aren't coming out and using these spaces. That's kind of expected. That was expected. But for me, I think the issue then is, if organizations are aware that these spaces are not being used in the way that they should be used, organizations that are responsible for green spaces, what are they doing about this situation? Or what could they be doing about this situation? My lived experience is that actually they're not quite ready to engage. They're not quite ready to get out and have discussions with these ethnic minority groups because maybe they don't know how to, because maybe they're not willing as yet to reach out to these groups. And so that means that Black groups in particular aren't able to take advantage of these spaces. The community engagement that happens is very much white, as Bridget has expressed it in the presentation. Actually, what we need as a group of minority groups is more of a personal outreach to understand what it is that matters to us. Now, I've been in the profession for over 10 years, and I almost feel like I need a PhD to be able to have a discussion with my managers about the real issues that affect Black and ethnic minority groups.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mary. I think that's a really important point, and we'll definitely come back to that when we have our panel discussion. Andrew, so Andrew Highland is our director at LDA Design, who are sponsors of this event. Andrew, do you want to share your reflections on
Yes.
Bridget's presentation?
Yeah, apologies for the problem earlier. Yeah, so, well, thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Bridget, for the presentation. I do find as I become more experienced and older, I know more about landscape design, but I also know and realise how much more I don't know. And I think Bridget's work is particularly valuable in galvanising us as a profession, essentially to follow the evidence, follow the data and the science rather than making assumptions, and to be aware of our influence, the influence of our training, and how that can lead to unconscious bias, and how we need to be open to a diverse group of aesthetic appreciation. You particularly asked me to respond to on the Olympic Park, and that, you know, it's really great to have that kind of detailed interrogation and research. Communities are diverse in their wants and needs. So parks need to be designed for diversity, and that's diversity of scale, you know, from large spaces for events to small, quieter spaces. Diversity of character, you know, whether they're meadow or ornamental gardens. Diversity of activity, from walking and picnics through to exercise and sport. And when LDA Design conceived of the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, it was as one single river park with a north and a south, and it was all designed at the same time and considered within one piece. And it was assumed that it would develop and change with two principal character areas. The North Park is kind of expansive green space, and the south, the more intensively used ornamental pleasure gardens. And that was about trying to meet a diverse range of needs. And NLDC's most recent survey reports that 94% of those who are living within the 4 neighbouring boroughs consider the park to be an asset for the whole community. And whilst BME groups, as Bridget highlighted, are not in parallel with local demographics, they're 40% of the users of the park. They have been increasing regularly over recent years, and we need to understand why that increase is continuing and how we can make that increase still further. The North Park also, during the pandemic, was used more than the South Park, I'm advised. And that swapped around during the pandemic, and it would be really good to understand why that is. Is that the true balance of the local community, without a significant proportion of visitors from Westfield and the new offices, which are close to the South Park and which were very quiet during the pandemic? And I think a further thing we need to reflect upon in relation to the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park is that it's a new park that is still establishing itself, and the neighbourhood is a place in flux. So connections into the wider community are improving. Diversity of uses continues to expand, the Canal Park and Here East. And the new UCL East Campus and East Bank Cultural Quarter are being designed to contribute to that wider park experience and to provide new and different opportunities for local people. So we need to keep finding ways of encouraging people to feel that it's their park, an everyday park. And finally, we've seen how COVID-19 is an amplifier of all inequalities. Society's response probably won't be a dramatic change, but I think the pandemic will hasten and magnify trends that are already apparent. And there is a growing appreciation that green space has an important part to play in health and well-being. But the funding for the management of our green spaces is under serious threat, and parks are not a statutory obligation. And this is going to have a direct effect on both the attractive nature, the safety and the welcome of parks. And the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, of course, will not be immune from these impacts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm now going to hand over to Carol Wright, who's a community gardener, beekeeper, project manager, and someone who's hugely passionate about parks and green spaces and has gathered a lot of information about how her local parks have been used during lockdown. Carol, your thoughts and reflections on Bridget's presentation?
Yeah, it's not surprising why BAME feel alienated from parks, because the one that I used most often in lockdown was LDA redesigned Burgess Park, and that had a Criminal Justice and Public Order Act served on it fairly soon into lockdown. So what you'd have police vans shouting at a predominantly Latinx and BAME communities, and there seemed to be kind of a little code of immunity going on for white middle class lycra clad users. It was very startling to see the racial disparities in Burgess Park, and which still continue actually, because Brunswick Park in Southwark, so Southwark are really good at this, Brunswick Park also has a dispersal order. You know, so we really are in Southwark calling on Councillor Johnson Situ, who heads up a project called Southwark Stands Together, about what the ruling Labour Party council are going to do about the inequality of seeing BAME in public space, in the public realm. So really, when we talk about this, whether it's in community gardens, whether it's while I'm doing beekeeping, in anything which I do, which is to do with the public realm. So you're not welcome in a public space, whether that's a park, Burgess, Elephant Park, elsewhere, which were all hazard taped off. So it was very clear you had to keep moving. If you didn't understand that, you understood that when the special patrol groups came into the area, so people were moved on by the police, whether that's in parks, whether that's in housing estates, with any greenery. But what has happened, and I've seen this, is an Instagram and people who've reached out to me, BAME groups are taking matters in their own hand when it comes to accessing nature. So you have as UK and Flock Together World. So I think these us in the community, we're not homogenous, I do know, are taking matters in our own hands. We're like, oh, you don't want us there, but guess what? We're going to form groups and go there. Whether it's the Olympic Park, whether it's Burgess, jogging, exercising. I've never seen so many women my mum's age exercising on tarmac in Aylesbury and then jogging along with their family to Burgess Park. So they're not waiting. And the friends of groups who get money, and I see you then there, Trina, we had a fraction and community projects, it would make a difference. I think the money needs to go And this will be from developers. This ain't going to be from the local authorities, because they're just about mashing down housing estates and social cleansing. If we get a fraction of the money, we'll do the groups ourselves and look at education, look at the schools, because it's the power is also within the parent teacher association, because it starts that young, developing relationship with the parks and with green spaces and landscape architecture and academia, because I really do think some of these surveys now should be a collaborative effort with academia and parks users, and those people giving their information should be paid. I think the days of just rocking up and expecting people to do placemaking free of charge needs to be knocked on the head, really. There you go. That's what I have to say about that.
Just to respond to Carol, when I did the PhD study, I did pay all of the participants because I totally agree with you. And I gave money to the community centres where we held the meetings. And I think that's how it should be done. And you need to recognise that people are giving up time, and time is money.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Bridget. Thanks very much, Carol. Now I'd like to pass over to Cohen Rutten. He's a project manager at the Town and Country Planning Association, brought in to support their work around inclusive planning. But Cohen also has an interest in LGBTQI politics and queer placemaking. So Cohen, hearing Bridget's presentation, what's your sort of responses to the issues that Bridget and your other panel members have raised?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Bridget, for that presentation. I think it very convincingly showed how whiteness shapes the profession and practice, and therefore the places we build. And I think similarly, we could say that heteronormativity, the normalization of heterosexuality and the gender binary do this as well. And of course, this has implications for how LGBTQI plus people, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex people access, use, and experience parks and the wider public realm. And I think first, and it's a point that Carol briefly made already, I think it's important to emphasize that we should really take an intersectional approach to that question. How do LGBTQI plus people experience parks? Their lived experiences are determined by other identities and are mediated by other factors, particularly class and race. So let's imagine if you are able to navigate streets or public space generally using Uber, or you need to take the bus, the level of street harassment that you're going to experience as a queer person on a daily basis is going to be very different. And that means that for us as policymakers and designers and the profession, we might imagine that there is such a thing as an LGBTQI plus community. That's a phrase I hear very often. But in reality, the LGBTQI plus communities have varying needs, experiences, aspirations, and some of those might even be, or might seem to be, contradictory, especially in terms of how they use public space and what visibility and safety in a park means to them. Just a few quick points. I think what is worth emphasizing is that LGBTQI plus people are really good at making amazing spaces. It goes back to what Carol was saying before, if we can't access space, we'll do it ourselves. That's an energy that LGBTQI plus people have as well, which has led to some amazing activities in parks. Think about Trans Pride in Soho Square and UK Black Pride in Haggerston Park. And as a profession, we need to think about how can we build on that. These examples also illustrate that the catchment areas of parks are not just the immediate environment. If you look at Hampstead Heath, a park that's being used by LGBTQI plus people across the entirety of London, probably, again, depending on their class position mostly, but so engagement cannot just happen with people in the immediate environment of a park. Finally, there's a point to be made around the assumption of safety. If we think that safety derives from visibility, increased policing, and lines of sight, that has, of course, implications for people that experience public harassment. So in particular, trans people might not necessarily feel safer in an environment where they're a lot more visible to the general public. So these are all things that we need to consider, really. A lot more to say, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cohen. Now I'd like to move over to Dr. Ozzy Stewart, who is a disabled person himself, but also an equality and diversity consultant with over 20 years experience. Ozzy, your reflections on Bridget's presentation and what you've heard from your fellow panel members.
First of all, I'd just like to say to Bridget, it's an amazing piece of work and gave me a real insight into the contested areas that spaces actually are. And it's been very interesting from that point of view. Obviously, disability was mentioned, won't say in passing, but it had a small mention. But I'd like to sort of, rather than talk about specifics about disability and specific examples, I want to give you the context to place disability in. It's a big word. How do we understand that? Firstly, I'll just simply say that disabled people in the UK are more likely to be living in poverty than anyone else. There are 4.2 million disabled people in poverty in the UK, which is 25% of the population as well living in poverty. They're more likely to be women as well than men. In terms of London, 14% of London's population would be described as disabled people, or 1.2 million people in that regard, in that context. Children, and it emphasises the point about poverty, it costs 3 times as much. 7% of the UK's population would be described as disabled children, or have families with disabled children in it. It costs 3 times as much to raise a disabled child as it does to raise a non-disabled child too. So you're already getting a pattern of the situations where people are already in poverty. There's the cost of being a disabled person. They're more likely to be unemployed. They're more likely to be, in terms of them, likely to be a woman. And also in terms of accessibility, disabled people don't use public transport. They're more likely to use cars or be passengers in cars, because public transport doesn't work for people at all in that way. So 38% of people who do travel use a car. So, and cars now being demonized, and that's an access issue. And also in housing, it's also housing as well is more likely to live in more high density housing in the poorest areas, so reflecting that situation too. And finally, the bit of research I could find on accessibility to public spaces only focused on shopping, cinemas and theatres, and also public pubs and restaurants, which were considered to be, people talk about their experience of accessing those things. Public spaces and parks were not included in that. So there's almost an assumption that disabled people don't even use those places, or that it's not a problem for them in lots of ways. So I think there's a lot to be said about that. And the final thing to bear in mind is, in terms of London, is health inequalities. I can tell you now, without knowing research, that you'll like to find a high percentage of female disabled people in London, children who are from minority communities too. So that presents a number of challenges there. We're talking about including disabled people in this space. If you go talk to older white women who are disabled people about their problems of accessing parks, you're going to replicate some of the issues that Bridget has talked about. So inclusion, co-production, and talking to the right people will require real insight into the population we're talking about here, because it's a vast and diverse population itself, representing lots of interests as well. But it's quite clear that it's more likely to be in poverty, living in the poorest areas of London, and from a minority community.
Thank you very much, Ozzy. That's great for sharing, and didn't appreciate those kind of statistics as well in there. Amazing. I'm now going to hand over to Trina Linsky. She's an independent children and families consultant committed to improving children's experience of the city. Trina, your reflections on what you've heard so far.
Good morning. Yes, my background's in early years, and I had no intention of becoming the chair of a park user group. However, I am typical of park user group chairs. I'm white and I'm female, and it is incumbent on park user groups to think about this. Being a park user group chair is not just about ethnicity, it's about profession as well. In order to be successful, you have to be able to write grant application forms, have good social media, all of those things that actually exclude a wide range of people from participating at that level. I'm in Deptford, and it's a low-income community, which is correlates in London a lot with high BAME populations, high population density, low car ownership, poor air quality, all of those things. So the reliance, or perhaps over-reliance on parks for communities, because they can't move around their local area easily, and they can't move to other areas to use other parks easily. It's really easy to get to the Olympic Park from here if you're able-bodied and if you're confident on public transport and if you don't have a number of children. But once you start to strip away those things that make things accessible, and then we're looking also at the enclosure of our estate property land. So a lot of the older estates were built with a lot of green space that isn't considered parks and is now being seen as a site for infill housing. And while we have a housing crisis, we have a simultaneous green space crisis, and you can't keep piling more people into communities and expecting it to work unless you give them the space to breathe. Over COVID times during the lockdown, it was these communities who were most impacted by a lack of access to private outdoor space. The other thing that happens, and one of the reasons Deptford Folk started as a park user group, was the enclosure of public land to be, to use for other purposes. And these can be all dressed up as worthy reasons to enclose land and make people pay to use the park. Maybe a horticulture project or a specific part of the park being fenced off for a minority of people to use as allotments. And for me, that, we are in a kind of a technocratic data and science driven world, which means that when people just use the park as flexible, non-programmed space, it doesn't have the same value as people who use it for a specific worthy reason. And I think that's problematic, because a lot of people just go to the park to do something that they want to do, and they leave it in the state they found it for someone else to use in a different way. There's also a lot of issues with what people call antisocial behavior. So trying to exclude people like street drinkers or young people from parks because they're not doing what we think is a worthy reason for being in a park. And, young people get a particular difficult time with this, especially young men, because if they're just hanging around on a park bench, it's seen as not as useful to them as playing an organized sport or doing something that improves their physical fitness in an obvious way. But actually, and particularly now, young people have had months of very isolated living. That time, that space where they can interact, where they can improve their negotiation skills, improve their social skills, is extremely important. And it links directly with youth violence, and it links directly with children's ability to perform well at school and succeed, because they have these negotiation skills. So moving these groups on, and street drinkers from the outside might be called antisocial behavior, but actually what they're doing is incredibly social. And while maybe what they're engaged in is not great for their own personal health, sometimes you can look at it and say those groups actually being together are supportive of each other in a world that's very unsupportive of them. And they are also there a lot of the times, and they will be your eyes and ears there, the kind of people who understand the park maybe better than others, who understand what the any intervention that you do in the park, any improvements might have an impact. So it's really important to include those groups. And we all, I think, have a love-hate relationship with the POPs, the privately owned public space. King's Cross and Canary Wharf are two of the bigger ones. They're clean, they're well maintained, they got lovely grass, well maintained and fertilized and all that you can go and sit on. But they are heavily patrolled and they are very secure. I used to work just north of King's Cross. And when the regeneration of that area was happening, the displacement of people from there up north or to the east and west, because they were no longer welcome in that space, and then it becomes the local authorities' problem to deal with, and an increase in it's not a shared approach. So I know that the Mayor of London is looking at POPs and how they will interact with the city, but it's a huge area where local authorities are very pleased to see new open spaces that are public, but are they fully inclusive? And I would say not right now. It's also really important to encourage BAME individuals to come forward with their ideas for parks. So we had a very successful project. We worked with Platform Cricket, specifically around encouraging young people to play cricket in the park. And it was phenomenally popular. We have a huge background in cricket lovers, especially in the older generations, and they were really pleased to see their children playing. We had a great turnout, and it was open to everybody. And so we had this social integration. And then we had a Catford-based cricketer, Daniel Bell Drummond, who plays for Kent, started a whole project about encouraging children into the parks, and I was very excited. It's brilliant. But I was really surprised by a reaction from certain people within the community who suddenly wanted there to be a consultation, who suddenly wanted to, there's no consultation on what we have already, but the minute someone wants to do something new or different, there's a barrier of consultation. And what it seems to mean is permission, that you need permission to come and do things in parks. And it was predominantly white men, including a ward councillor, who were trying to raise issues with this project going in. And I was really surprised by that, because I see park user groups as a sort of a facilitator or giving people a voice, not as a blockage and not as a means of using consultation to exclude people. And so, it made me think about all of these consultations were happening all the time, many with no outcome, and how they need to be more inclusive and not used as a barrier to bringing change. And for me, bringing in those projects, bringing in new people to the park is the way to get people, as young people, to then think about more aspects of the park. So people might come and play cricket or football, and then they start saying, but this play space isn't suitable for me, or I really enjoyed looking at the birds here. Can I learn more about them? And that's how you build your park user or your park owners of the future, is to get them in when they're young. So I'll finish with my primary thing that I do, and it's about play. And in the slides that Bridget showed there, we can see that of all the activities that people want to do in parks, playgrounds and play for their children are the most important. And they're severely underfunded here in Deptford, and we're working on that at the moment. It was the #1 reason people visited parks when we did our park surveys. It was the #1 thing they wanted to improve. Play is a lifeline, and it's really fundamental integration. You go to a park with children, and those children mix and the parents mix, and it's a leveler, and we experience the same issues because that's how children do. The school gate is incredibly important, and creating safe school routes. And I'm pleased to see a lot of the Mayor of London's Street Space programme focuses on school streets and school routes and connecting them within neighbourhoods. So you can finish at school and go to the park and everyone integrates. And that becomes a more inclusive group and society. When you design...
Sorry, Tarina, I'm going to have to close you off there, just so I can make sure everyone else has a say. But thank you so much, and we'll come back to some of your points in the Q&A, I'm sure. So thank you for that. But I'd like to hand over to Rowan Longhurst. She's a landscape architect and currently oversees the running of our Park Life, a CIC in the Queen Elizabeth Park that is committed to ensuring that volunteering, training and employment opportunities are available to local people. So Rowan, your thoughts and reflections in 3 minutes, please. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think for me, many of the points that Bridget picked up on, both as a landscape architect and also now leading a CIC where we put volunteers really front and foremost of our activities. It's about trying to have a real range of activities or a real range of engagement opportunities, and there's no one size fits all. Certainly our volunteer programme on Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park is big. It's big in terms of volume, and it's big in terms of the number of people that get involved. We absolutely see the issues that are experienced across the voluntary sector about different groups of volunteers being interested in different things. And I get asked very often, how diverse is your volunteer team? What are they doing? How often are they coming? And in fact, you can't really... it depends on the groups that you're looking at, and it depends on what the offer is and how you can provide something that works for everybody. So we have an incredibly broad diversity within our volunteer team, but that's not across all the roles. Some groups really enjoy some activities and others enjoy others. Also in terms of the commitment that they can give, and I think that the word volunteering in the voluntary sector can often be a real barrier in itself. There's a certain sort of stigma or a certain preconception about what volunteering is. And actually, when you try to talk to communities about coming on to the park and giving up some of their time, whether it's to access training, whether it's to meet friends, whether it's to do something completely different to the day job, or whether it's something that complements the day job, or if it's just simply to get out of the house, we're finding that the variety of things that you can offer and the ease at which people can access different things is absolutely critical, and the transiency of a lot of our volunteers as well. We have some who've been with us since day one, and some we'll only see once and then they're gone again. And I think it's really important to value and to try and provide an opportunity for everyone in a program if you can, and if your park or if your community or if your program has that opportunity. I think what's interesting that we've seen on the park over the last 5 or 6 years is that focus from kind of sport and using the park for a sort of more formal sporty activity has changed, and certainly the evidence that we've seen is it's more a place for leisure, which is really interesting now. And I think that will have been reflected in COVID times as well. People are using parks in a really creative range of ways, and Carol touched on it, and others have touched on how parks are now seen as a place for leisure, and it's maybe framed in a different way, and the sort of health and well-being benefits of that are really, really important. I think that having something, and certainly our volunteer program, and I'm sure many others struggle with this, but it's critical, is it's about what's economically viable and what's accessible, and that goes at something that Bridget touched on in her work, and we see, I guess, across parks as a whole and across a volunteer program. You know, it has to be economically accessible, and if not, people will not be able to come, or certainly it could be the sort of deal breaker. There's one really interesting piece of research, and some people may have heard about it, but I can put it in the chat. Piece of small research that was done by a researcher called Helen Timbrell earlier this year, called "What the Bloody Hell Are You Doing Here?" And it was focused on 4 organisations and their volunteer programmes and the representation of BAME volunteers in a volunteer program, and I think that's something that's has helped us focus our next steps in diversifying our volunteer program. And it's really interesting, really kind of accessible piece of research, and there's a really useful piece online by the Association of Volunteer Managers where they talk to Helen and a member of her sort of user group, and I'd recommend anyone who's interested in diversifying their volunteer program, that's a really good place to start, and it's certainly helped us frame our next steps. I think just finally with my landscape architect hat on, it's interesting again across Bridget's research that access and interest to wildlife, although the smallest dot is the consistently sized dot. And I think with a landscape architect's hat on, the ecological aesthetic that we see most recently in that kind of trend that Bridget talked about, we still have a responsibility as landscape architects to be that sort of voice for nature and for ecology that doesn't have a voice. And so it is really important for us to understand that our environmental responsibilities are really important, and how we can not sort of sacrifice some of those really important ecological challenges whilst trying to design parks for people. But yeah, really looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Rowan. And then finally over to Dan Cook, who's Chief Executive of the Landscape Institute. Now, Dan, I know this is diversity, something that you've been looking at in the profession since you joined. So your reflections on Bridget, and then everybody, we're going to go straight into the Q&A. So I can see we've all got questions already in there, but do post up your questions, and we've got about 20-25 minutes for your for your to hear your insights and get your questions answered. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Nicola. And I actually grew up on the New South Wales Central Coast of Australia, and the region I grew up in, probably at least 30% of it's national parks, and we've got significant waterways. And even growing up across the road from me, there was a park with quite an adventurous children's playground, I've got to say, growing up. It had a lot of risk in it, and you know, I've got a real appreciation of outdoor spaces, and having from sort of my childhood, really. And my dad worked for the Parks and Recreation part of the local council, and was also a lifeguard in the summer, and worked on the Parks and Recreation side during the winter. So I've kind of grown up with understanding a lot about parks and green spaces, and later was a city councillor in my home city as well. So, you know, particularly contested use of space is something that is, you know, we used to have it between younger communities and children and youth and older retirees in spaces was a big issue where I grew up. We didn't have much ethnic diversity in that part of New South Wales. But, you know, when I moved to London, I found it quite interesting that the spaces here seem to have a lot of boundaries. They seem to have a lot of fences. They seem to be very unappealing, and almost to try and block you out of using the spaces. And I found that quite interesting even during lockdown. I've got to know my local park, Brockville Park, very, very well. It's my usual trip out of a 5-kilometre walk and enjoying the space. But what I noticed was at the beginning of the lockdown, the kind of taping up of seats and the taping up of exercise equipment and all almost acted as a deterrent to people to use the space. And then it was really only after that intensive lockdown started to actually be lifted a little bit that actually you started to see greater use of the space and much more diverse communities returning to the space, particularly once you could do sort of physical exercise. I always think of Bridget's research actually when I'm going to the park now in terms of looking at who's actually using the space and what they're doing. Bridget, you're responsible for that for me in terms of actually, you know, paying more attention to what's actually going on in terms of use of public space. And I have noticed that change over the last couple of months. So, but what I will say is that I'm relatively fit, and, you know, at the age where, you know, mobility is not a problem. But actually it's at least a kilometre and a half walk to any of the major parks from where I live. And in the centre of Brixton, there's actually not a lot of usable large green space that's particularly inviting. And I think that's something that, you know, we've done a policy piece just recently on greener recovery. I'll share that in the chat later. But, you know, many people have even further barriers from where they live to have accessible, usable space. And I think that's something that you know, collectively as a sector we need to address. I also think that there's opportunities for particularly anyone who's in landscape architecture to influence the future as well. And it's well worth a look at our award winner from last year, Conswater Community Greenway. So major government funded like lottery grant, but they designed it with a view to increasing physical activity. And the actual, if they achieve a 2% uplift in physical activity levels, it would actually pay for the park in its lifetime value. And so as a result, they engage communities to put what communities needed in the space. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from that. But, you know, our profession would be much better at that if it was also more representative. And so we've recognised that we do have a problem as an institute, as a profession, as a sector. Only 5% of our members are from diverse backgrounds versus a 14% general population. And in terms of going forward, we know that we need to do more with our employers and educators to help change that. And we're refocusing our efforts at the moment to become more inclusive. And some of the things we're doing are technician graded membership, apprenticeships, having diversity and inclusion and inclusive environments will be new core requirements for our profession going forward. And the way we operate has to change. I mean, we will only do diverse panels at our events now. We are improving diversity across my own team, but there's so much more still to do. We need to create a network for our BAME practitioners. We also need to do more training on these issues for our active volunteers and as an organisation, my staff team and all included. I think we're on a journey in this space, but I think it would be, you know, when we have to act in the public interest in everything we do as a Royal Chartered body, it's implicit on you know, it's essential for us to actually be more representative of wider society. And I think users of parks, green spaces and landscapes will be better for it if there's that greater diversity among the professionals in all of the green space environment and built environment professions going forward. So thanks.
All right, thanks Dan, and thanks so much to the panel. It's obviously such a massive topic. There's loads of different aspects to it, really being brought to the fore by Bridget's research. So I really want to go straight to Q&A so we get a chance to answer some of your questions. For me, one of the key issues is around the profession being better at talking to local communities and really understanding what people need, and genuine consultation. Points being raised about paying for people's time, because to value people's time. Mary's point about, is the profession ready for the answers, and is it upskilled enough? So there's a question from Joanna here that says, I'd be interested to know how you feel developers, private or public, and I think I'd include that to anyone working in the profession really, how can they do better to consult and engage with a broader range of voices and experience? And some of the other people who've added their comments in the Q&A talk about the kind of limited resources. So I don't know who in the panel wants to take that first. Maybe Carol, just about how you think the profession can be better in terms of engaging with groups.
Well, the one thing is that developers do have a lot of money to do consultation, because there's a consultation about the redesign of, I forget, the central London square, Grosvenor Square.
Yeah.
So the money is definitely with the developers. So they have to go to the places where they know, and like to consult with people, local authorities where they're building the new developments know where people gather, or if they don't, they're not a very good local authority. And that needs to be faith-based as well, and sports centres. So, and I think Cohen was saying this, go to places beyond on the doorstep, because if you just go on the doorstep, you're just going to get a very, very limited view, because parks attract people from further afield. So yeah, that's what I would say. Go further to get some of those responses, and certainly include schools, because the thing is, I don't know of any consultation that I've been involved with that actually goes to local schools. I don't think Elephant Park did. Lend-Lease, when they've done that, they do fun days, but that's a different thing. So yeah, that's what I say. Go further and go to where you know people congregate. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Cohen, and then Ozzy.
I think first point is know who you're talking to. So I quite consciously spoke about LGBTQI plus communities or people, simply because intersex people are very often forgotten as members of this particular group, specifically their politics and the forms of violence that they experience. But if you're talking to an older generation of people, you might quite consciously want to leave out queer, because that's often being perceived as offensive, whereas people from my generation are much more comfortable with that term. So these really, that very detailed and niche, almost niche language obviously matters a lot to people in terms of feeling heard and feeling understood by the profession. And I think the second point I'd say is acknowledge power dynamics, and a way of doing that is by properly compensating people. If you enter a conversation as the only one who's on the salary, that creates, at least in that specific role, right, that creates a power dynamic which I don't think is helpful for genuine participation. And acknowledge resentment. Communities might have had experiences with the council or with developers in the past that make them apprehensive to participate, and there are very legitimate reasons for that. I think what a lot of people don't realize, specifically for LGBTQI plus communities, it was only in 23 when Section 28 was revoked, which did not allow or discourage local authorities from what was called promoting homosexuality. these people are still around, right? People that experienced the violence following that Section 28 are still here. Obviously those experiences inform how people perceive professionals and the wider sort of built environment sector, and there needs to be space in consultation exercises to to address that.
Thank you very much, Cohen. Ozzy, did you put your hand up?
Yeah, I did, just briefly here. Don't reinvent the wheel. Social care has been consulting with disabled people and communities for a very long time. So you could learn from those mechanisms, but don't make their mistakes. Keep it local. Who are you talking to? Who are the audience? What local authorities tend to do is talk to a known group of people who aren't reflective of local communities. So you need to be very mindful of that. But we call it co-production. And Cohen mentioned power, and I think Carol mentioned too. Power is important. Resourcing and recognizing you're equal partners here, and making sure that those people feel they're in control of the debate, rather than just being just asked their opinion and then said, go away, thank you much indeed. It's much more than that. So consultation isn't consultation, it's actually sharing power about constructing something new.
And that's not always comfortable for people, is it? The whole idea of sharing power. So yeah, Bridget, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just the one thing from my nerdy social science background is that the emergent effects are not seen if you don't actually try to look for them. So if you just ask people, even if you measure that you've asked, 5% of your respondents from a particular age group or whatever, if you don't then look to see across that age group what those responses were, or whatever characteristic, you're not going to actually know if there's any variation because of age or because of gender or because of sexuality. And therefore, it's really important that you actually do try to keep linked the feedback that you've got with some of these demographic characteristics, because it's been shown time and again that there are relationships between identity and use and experience of space. And so, we should be being more onto that. And I think also, like in my research where I was looking at ethnicity, if I'm looking for cultural effects, there's not much point in me taking a category of African or Asian to find cultural effects, because those are racial effects. That's not a cultural thing. Africa is a continent. It's full of multiple cultures. So actually, because we're looking at, in some ways, mixing ethnicity and race, you need to kind of really be thinking about. I was really struck by differences between British Bangladeshi responses, British Pakistani responses, British Indian responses, in terms of the way that they were talking and experiencing space. And that just shows me how I had just thought, oh yeah, Asian responses, that's a thing. We're all of us absorbing racism. We're all of us capable of it. We just have to really try to be really more reflexive and thoughtful.
Okay. Thank you. Does anyone want to come up on that point? Or, oh yeah, sorry, Trina, yeah.
Yeah, just, what Ozzy said is very true. As a park user group chair and with a cash-strapped local authority, it's very easy for them to come to me, get my opinion and say that they've consulted, and it's not, because park user groups are lobby groups. So it's really important that those park user groups are open and accessible as well. And what Carol said about going into schools, we do a lot of work in schools because I have that educational bias anyway, but it is, it's a statutory requirement for children to go to school. They're all in there. So if you work with schools and school gates, you get a broader cross of the community than just the people who've already come to a park. If you only survey people who are in the park, you're not getting the people who for some reason or another don't feel welcome or comfortable in that park. So it's looking beyond the park's borders to see why people are not coming in, and making sure that those consultations are fully inclusive, and making sure that people are consulted widely and not just referring to the local park user group, which might be 2 or 3 people who never have a public meeting. So it's really important that that's reflected in consultation.
Thank you. Okay, Mary. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. I was just thinking about where the most influence in terms of community consultation, community engagement is. And usually with the professionals, landscape architects, and then, you know, local organizations like councils that have an impact on how community engagement is done. A lot of time, the consultants don't have the budget to do the actual work that needs to be done. And so it becomes very much a tick-off exercise. However, wherever the decisions that are taken to do community engagement correctly or the right way, at that point, I don't believe there is a real understanding of what needs to be done to do a thorough community engagement job. So in the end, for the consultant and for the council, it becomes very much a tick-off exercise. So we have to rethink as a profession, as organizations that are responsible for green spaces, we have to rethink how we influence people to get into parks. So the type of discussion that we have, developers specifically take on consultants, and then after the initial envisioning is done, they don't do enough work to ensure that the end user is well represented. And so the people making the decision at that stage, the planning, assessment, and developing of regeneration projects, that needs a rethink on how we move forward.
Mm. And does anyone, and it's interesting, a point was brought up in the Q&A that it's not just about consultation, but it's actually about co-design, which is picking up on Cohen's point and Carol's about the kind of balance of power as well, and actually giving people a much stronger influence. But what Mary's just saying is that, well, is the appetite there, and are the skills there for us to be able to do it properly? We've just got a couple of minutes, and I wonder if anyone wants to contribute some examples of good practice. Dan, you had your
hand up. Look, I noticed there are a couple of questions on this topic actually, and I've put a couple of resources in the chat around. It's well worth looking. We've got a technical note on inclusive design, but also Design Council have some free modules on inclusive environments as well. And the Construction Industries Council has a guidance for all built environment professions in regard to this. But what I would just say, an emerging field of practice, if you like, is that whole topic of collaborative design. Particularly our Southwest branch, the Landscape Institute ran a whole lot of events through last year. And it was a multidisciplinary group of professionals. They've set up an association of collaborative design. It has planners, landscape architects, and others within it. But it's well worth a look, particularly some of the work out of Knoll West Media Centre. Zoe Grossbanks, who's got a whole, it's called the Bristol Approach, and it's all around empowering communities, not just engaging with them. And Sarah Jones-Morris and also Dr. Noah Nasser are some of the people involved in that group. They're all very impressive individuals who understand that importance of understanding communities and making sure their voices are heard in the design process. So I'd point people in that direction as some of the area of emerging practice that is coming through now.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Dan. I'm going to draw us to a close. We've got 5 minutes, and I wonder if I can ask each of our panelists just to say, if there could be one thing that you could recommend to our audience, what would that be? But it literally will have to be in sort of 20 words, and I'll just run through the screen. Just one thing you think that you would make a recommendation to the sector, to volunteers that are working in parks of green spaces. So I'm just going to go across the top of the screen. If you keep this really brief so that we can finish at 11 o'clock. So starting with Cohen, go for it.
I think real quick, resources for communities, planning aid, enabling them to participate. It's not just costly in terms of we need to compensate them. They need to have the skills and the understanding of how the system works in order for them to meaningfully participate. So check out Planning Aid for London as one organisation that's doing that. Thank you very much, Cohen. And then we're going to go to Rowan and then to Mary.
I think for me, it's about thinking about the long term and not just about the window of opportunity that's given to you in a planning process. It's about thinking about the long term planning, management, funding, governance structures of what needs to happen to support our parks and places for years and years and years to come.
Thank you very much. We'll do Mary and then Ozzy.
So for me, I think it has to be top down as well as bottom up, because without the people in charge understanding the importance of why they need to engage with communities and get results that suit those people, and then empowering the people to take ownership within this process. So the people around the table have got to be the right balance, top down, bottom up.
Thank you very much, Mary. So Ozzy and then Trina.
Remember, think about those invisible people. You see disabled people every single day, but you don't see them. You don't ask the right questions, and you don't think about their world from their perspective. As Bridget said, equality is not about treating people the same. So you need to be really nuanced and think about that and include people. Wheelchair users are not only disabled people. There are lots of other groups of people too. Think very carefully about that.
Thank you very much, Ozzy. Trina and then Andrew.
Invest in facilities for children and young people. They are the future. Success depends on their integration and their positive engagement with green space. Invest in public toilets and accessible public toilets so that everyone can use green space, and make sure there are benches and bins in parks. The fundamentals, get those right, and then do the fancy landscaping and everything, but just make sure that they're accessible to all.
Thank you, Trina. So Andrew, Dan.
Thanks, Nicola. I think the biggest thing is about the listening. It's about where you start and really understanding what's needed. And as a consultant, I'm completely with Mary, which is one of the biggest challenges is actually the willingness to commit to invest in proper listening. And I think Trina picked this up as well, actually genuine, thorough listening, providing the time and actually moving some of it even into the community rather than actually having people from outside coming in and asking, trying to embed it absolutely in the heart of the people you're asking.
Thank you, Andrew. So we'll go Dan, Carol and Bridget.
Yeah, look, I think one of the big things for me, and it sort of follows on from Andrew and Mary, is proper funding for doing the job properly of that engagement and empowerment, but then flowing through when it comes to parks and green spaces and nature, proper funding for the long-term care, management and maintenance as well. I mean, I grew up in Australia. We put a lot more value on properly funding the maintenance of our public spaces and recreational facilities and nature. So I would urge we need to see a massive shift here to do that here as well.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So Carol and then lastly, Bridget.
Yeah, I agree with revenue funding, but also I think that Trina said something important about having the ability to fundraise. So it's a power thing. So be knocking on Deptford Park's door for sessions, because this is what we've been talking about for years, that we do need those tools. We do need those allies to create the surveys ourselves, rather than always people coming and having a cup of tea and a biscuit and asking us our business, really. So that's that.
Thank you very much, Carol and Bridget.
Yeah, it's always difficult to try to think of one thing, but I think for me, the overarching thing is that the problem of a lack of diversity in green spaces, nature spaces, landscape architecture has been being discussed since, at the very least, the 1970s. And I think white people need to get a grip on their white privilege. They need to stop being so blind to the fact that we have a cultural position, and we should really go with Black Lives Matter.
Okay, thank you very much, Bridget. A very, very powerful way to finish the discussion. Thank you so much to our panel. It's been incredibly insightful, and I hope you in the audience have really enjoyed that and gained from the discussion, the debate and the different views and perspectives. There's obviously some really clear messages coming out around engagement and empowerment, white privilege, the ability to be able to properly listen to communities. We've got to draw it to a close, so I'd like to thank the GLA and LDA Design for sponsoring the event. We could carry on talking for hours on this issue, and if people are interested in this topic, then please do drop me a line. nicola@futureoflondon.org.uk, because I would quite like to continue the conversation and see what we can do at Future of London. If you want to continue the chat, then you're very, very welcome to continue the conversation. We have to close this meeting, but you will have now been emailed a link, and it's in the chat box as well, to join another meeting where we're just going to have informal chats in breakout rooms, just an opportunity, as I said at the beginning, for you to kind of connect with people that are on the event. So if you'd like to do that, click finish this meeting now, and click on that link in your email, and by all means, let's keep the conversation going. So thank you so much again for everyone that's participated. Great to have so many people joining us today. Take care, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Thank you. Bye.